Welcome, welcome. Can you hear me? Welcome, everyone. We're going to get started. Good afternoon. My name is Deb Bruner. I am the Senior Vice President for Research at Emory University. I'm also the Executive Sponsor for Science Gallery Atlanta. So welcome to today's panel discussion on the human impacts of disaster, understanding the climate and resilience nexus. Now for the commercial part of the show, I'm truly delighted to welcome you to the new digs and the unveiling of our third exhibition for Science Gallery, and this one is called Resilient Earth, which is perfect for this discussion. A bit about the space. Science Gallery Atlanta is part of an international network of universities in 9 countries. We are the only ones in the United States dedicated to the fusion of science and art for public engagement. It is free to the public, as is the parking. It is open Wednesdays through Sundays. Please bring your friends and children. And it's available Mondays and Tuesdays for school groups, and we also do events here, as you'll see tonight. And now back to our regularly scheduled program. I'm so pleased for Emory to be partnering with the American Security Project, a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization dedicated to educating the American public about the changing nature of national security. The American Security Project has been a key communicator of climate security challenges for the past decade. And we are thrilled to welcome ASP to the Science Gallery Atlanta and Emory University. Your all attendance here reflects the growing recognition of the critical issues we're about to discuss. A special thank you to Professors Yang Liu and Mackenzie Beveridge. Raise your hands. There we go. All right. Of the Emory Climate Research Initiative for their expert coordination of this event. The Emory Climate Research Initiative was established by Emory's Provost Belmconda 2 years ago with the goal of fostering an interdisciplinary academic community to research and educate on climate change. And I have been a very proud co-sponsor of this program, watching this group grow and actually change the face of what we're doing at Emory. It's been a privilege. Convening leading policy, academic, and legal experts at panels such as this is aligned with the activities of the Climate Research Initiative at Emory. As we are all aware, the increase in climate change fueled extreme weather events that we see on the TV every day, and compounding disasters is having a profound impact on all sectors of society. These changes are forcing communities to confront new challenges and rethink old paradigms in order to build a more resilient future. Here in Georgia, our weather patterns are shifting significantly. We are experiencing warmer and wetter conditions, which have serious implications for sea level rise, our infrastructure, and our public health. These changes compel us to explore not just the immediate impacts, but also the long-term strategies for resilience and adaptation, which many of you here are expert in. Our panel today brings together a wealth of expertise from various fields to discuss how Georgia is preparing for climate change and the critical connections between climate action and public health and our journey toward climate resilience. We will delve into the science, the policies, and the practical actions being taken to address these pressing issues. I am honored to introduce our esteemed panelists who will share their insights and experiences with us. Councilman Jason Dozier. Councilman Dozier is an Atlanta City Councilman with expertise on how the City of Atlanta and local governments prepare for climate change. He has been a leading voice on Atlanta City Council on climate change and environmental justice. Professor Michelle Ritchie is with the Institute of Disaster Management at the University of Georgia. She has deep expertise in coastal vulnerabilities and climate change adaptation and mitigation, and teaches emergency and disaster management studies. Seems like we all need those these days. Emory University's own Professor Mark Nevitt is an associate professor of law. He is an expert on the intersection of security, environment, and climate change. He brings expertise to this topic as both a law professor and a former naval officer and environmental lawyer working on climate solutions with the U.S. Navy. Finally, the panel is being expertly moderated by Mr. Matthew Wallin, the American Security Project's Chief Operating Officer. We're honored that he's flown in from Washington to join us tonight. Mr. Wallin has led ASP's research on public diplomacy and strategic communications since 2011 and has deep expertise in public diplomacy and national security policy. Before we begin, just one announcement. We are going to have a Q&A session, so we ask that you hold all your questions for that session. So thank you for joining us today. Let's engage in a thoughtful and productive dialogue on how we can work together to mitigate the impacts of climate change and build a resilient future for Georgia and beyond. Please join me in welcoming the esteemed panel.
Welcome, everyone. I'm Matthew Wallin. I'm the Chief Operating Officer of the American Security Project. Thank you, everybody, for joining ASP and Emory University at this evening's event here at the Science Gallery, Atlanta. For those of you not familiar with ASP, we're a nonpartisan national security think tank located in Washington, D.C., founded on the principle of building bipartisan consensus around a shared vision of national security in the 21st century. This is my first time in Atlanta, but not ASP's first trip outside of DC. This is in fact the 45th such stop that ASP has made as part of its National Climate Security Tour, in which we've helped organize events around the country like this to bring the message of how climate change isn't just a green issue, it's a national security issue. ASP sees climate change as an accelerant to instability. It's a factor that leads to stresses on societies like food scarcity, migration, resource competition, and even border disputes, the kinds of problems that make military conflict more likely. It poses challenges to military readiness, whether that comes in the form of lost training days due to heat or fire risk, or naval bases that are routinely flooded, cutting off transportation routes onto the base, or literally making piers inaccessible because they're simply underwater. We're holding this event at a time when the predictions for climate change aren't looking great. Here in Georgia, the sea level around Fort Pulaski has seen 11 inches of sea level rise since 1950. That rate has increased to over an inch every 2 years. Hunter Army Airfield will see 4 to 6 feet of sea level rise by the end of the century. Kings Bay Naval Base will flood 26 times per year by 2050. According to the researchers at Climate Check, Georgia ranks 8th in the country for the highest heat and precipitation risk. But with all the climate impacts we're seeing, from ASP's perspective, it's important to note that the military bases in Georgia are leading the way in preparing for a climate-challenged environment. For instance, Marine Corps' logistic base, Albany here in Georgia, has become the first net zero base in the country. We couldn't do these events without the incredible support of our local partners like Emory University. So let me thank the Emory team here and the Science Gallery Atlanta for all of the behind-the-scenes work that has gone in to make this event possible and to bring this conversation to you. They've made my job really easy, to be frank. Now, I've talked enough, and as moderator of the event, I feel the best use of my role is to simply turn it over to our panelists. I do want to make a note to mention Dr. Michelle Covey, who's also one of our panelists. She's the Coastal Resilience DoD Liaison at the Marine Extension and Georgia Sea Grant at the University of Georgia. And she joined the unit in September 2021 and works regionally with Southeast to connect Sea Grant programs with military community coastal resilience projects through a partnership with SERPAS and the Department of Defense. So with that, I want to turn it over to our panelists. We're going to give everybody a few minutes to remark on the work that they're doing and their experience with climate change here in the state. We'll go right down the row. We'll do a little bit of Q&A, and towards the end, we'll open up to questions and answers for the audience. So please get those queued up. There will be a mic that will be available for that. So with that.
Hello, can everyone hear me all right? I apologize in advance. I will be reading from my phone. I did not have any time to print this morning, so I appreciate your forgiveness here. But good afternoon or evening, I'm not quite sure at this point. Thank you for joining us, and please definitely stick around after so that we can have some one-on-one conversation. Already had some good conversation, love to have some more. So it's a privilege for me to be here today to discuss this issue that's not just urgent, but growing more urgent by the day, which is the impact of climate change on human health and security. Climate change is not a distant or abstract threat. It's happening now. It's affecting people right here in Georgia, across the United States, and elsewhere. So again, my name is Ritchie. I'm an assistant professor at the University of Georgia's Institute for Disaster Management, where I primarily research the impacts of climate change, including how we can mitigate and adapt to these impacts. I'm a social scientist, and I mostly use mixed qualitative and creative methods. My research is primarily in the Arctic, so I hope to contribute to today's conversation through lessons learned elsewhere. So if people talk about climate change, and that's a big if, they tend to talk about it in terms of melting polar ice sheets or endangered wildlife, but today I really want to focus on that real, local, human impacts of climate change. We're here to discuss the way climate change is reshaping our communities, our health, and our national security. Atlanta, for example, has already warmed much more than 1 degree Celsius since the 1970s. So first, we could consider health consequences of this warming. Our rising temperatures are leading to more frequent and severe heat waves, which disproportionately affect vulnerable populations like the elderly, low-income communities, and those with pre-existing health conditions. So the risk of heat-related illnesses, like heat exhaustion and heat stroke, is rapidly increasing, and you can learn more about that actually through one of the cool exhibits here today. So over the last 10 years, for example, thousands of people have visited the hospital due to heat-related illnesses, and this puts a strain on our hospitals and our emergency systems as they cope with this new reality. Of course, health threats don't stop with just heat. Warmer temperatures and shifting weather patterns are expanding the range of vector-borne diseases. Think mosquitoes, ticks, and other insects. These vectors are spreading illness like West Nile, Lyme disease to areas that haven't had to deal with them before, which poses serious challenge for our public health systems through new surveillance and testing. And then there's the issue of air quality. As temperatures rise, so can the concentration of ground-level ozone and particulate matter, which worsens respiratory conditions like asthma, lung disease, and infection. And poor air quality generally hits urban communities hardest, where populations may already be grappling with economic and health disparities. And children and seniors are particularly vulnerable. But beyond health, climate change also threatens food and water security. Georgia's agriculture sector we can look at, which is crucial to the state's economy, is being disrupted by unpredictable weather patterns, including droughts, freezes, and floods. We can look to 2023 when Georgia farmers lost some 90% of their peach crops due to a freeze in the peach state, no peaches. These disruptions don't just affect farmers, they impact everyone who relies on that food supply chain. So when we talk about water, we also have to consider the quality and the quantity of water we have. Rising sea levels, for example, are threatening to contaminate freshwater supplies with salt water, while droughts make it harder for communities to access the water they need. So it's sort of a 1-2 punch. And all of this, the heat, the diseases, the threats to food and water, has serious security implications. Climate change is not just an environmental issue, it is a national security issue. The Pentagon has recognized climate change as a threat multiplier, which is something that exacerbates existing tensions and vulnerabilities. So when communities are stressed by food shortages, extreme weather, or a lack of access to clean water, the potential for conflict increases. Here in the US, extreme weather events are displacing people, damaging critical infrastructure, and straining local economies. And as disasters impact more communities and the cost of these disasters increases, we're seeing an increase in migration within the US and across borders, creating challenges, for example, with disaster preparedness, emergency services, long-term housing, resource distribution, the list goes on. While these challenges are real and growing, it's important to remember we have the tools and knowledge to address them. What we need is the collective will to act at the individual, local, state, and federal levels together. We need to invest in climate solutions, from strengthening public health infrastructure to ensuring our communities are prepared for extreme weather events. We need policies that ensure the most vulnerable among us, those who disproportionately are affected by climate change, are not left behind and that they're in fact included in the decision-making processes, because ultimately Addressing climate change is about protecting people. It's about safeguarding our health, communities, and security, and I think today's discussion will be an important step towards understanding these complex issues and hopefully highlighting some pathways forward. Thank you.
Thank you. I think you read straight off of some of ASP's materials because we're speaking the same language. Dr. Covey.
Certainly, thank you. So you get two Michelles in a row, and we both are from UGA and both live in Athens. So, but we do really different work. So my role is a Coastal Resilience DoD liaison, and what I do is actually go out and work with those communities that Dr. Ritchie here was talking about. So as I'm a part of a group that's called Sea Grant, and Sea Grant is a partnership between NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, and universities. And we do extension work. So if you're familiar with cooperative extension that goes out and works with farmers, we're a kind of extension that goes out and works with coastal communities. And one of the areas, one of our 4 focus areas, is resilient communities and economies. And so we go out and work with the folks in these communities to help them to build their resilience to climate change. We don't spend a huge amount of time debating climate change. We have kind of gotten past that, especially in coastal communities that have experienced sea level rise. That was something that when I first got into this about 15 years ago, it was more of a debate. Now it's very much a reality, and folks are at the point of what do we do? How do we get through this? And they're sometimes surprised how much the military, how much DoD has really is all in on climate adaptation. Pretty much, and this they've been aware of and thinking about this probably since at least 2008 or so. There's been, climate change has been identified as a threat multiplier. But in more recent years, up until 2019, there have been new orders that have come down that have actually directed installations to start making resilience plans on the installation. And there have been new avenues of funding that actually goes to communities, and a lot of people aren't aware of this. The program that I work most closely with in DoD is a Office of the Secretary of Defense program, which is called the REPI program. It stands for Readiness and Environmental Protection Integration, and they exclusively fund projects that are outside of the installation. So they help communities that are around the installation because they recognize that when either soldiers or civilians or sailors cannot get to their place of duty, that is a security risk. That is not accomplishing their mission. So because I never can remember statistics off the top of my head, I will read some of these. So for instance, the military economic impact on Georgia is about $22 billion annually, and it's most significant in many of the places are rural areas where the installations are located. That averages up to 30% of the economy in many of these rural places. So the military investment is significant in Georgia. The total DoD personnel is over 124,000 at 8 installations, counting active duty, civilian personnel, and reservists. They manage large tracts of land for their testing operations and training missions. Fort Stewart, which is part of Hunter Army Airfield that Matt mentioned, is the largest Army facility east of the Mississippi. It controls 280,000 acres, and Fort Moore, which is on the other end, closer here to the Alabama border, is 182,000 acres that they manage. And the REPI program that I work with since 2005 has invested $213 million, and that has been matched by partner contributions. So these are NGO or other federal agencies of about $200 million. And while not all of this has been for climate adaptation, it is more and more going towards climate adaptation and nature-based solution actions. And nature-based solutions are, they could be conservation, restoration projects, or they can be a combination of engineering projects and nature-based projects. And the military has been definitely all in on those nature-based solutions as well, and trying to be at the forefront of managing those. A lot of people don't know that the DoD is the #1 manager of threatened and endangered species in the United States. Even though they don't have the most land of any federal agency, they manage the most species. And sometimes when there is an endangered species on an installation, that will impede their ability to train, for instance, on that installation. And so one of the things that they do is they try to work with farmers and foresters around the installation to encourage them to keep their farms, keep their working lands, and encourage management ways that those species can live on those lands instead of living entirely on the installations. And so they protect those areas. And one of these areas in Georgia is called the Georgia Sentinel Landscape. And this is actually a partnership between DoD, the Department of the Interior, and the USDA. And actually FEMA is going to join that partnership, or they're in the process of joining that partnership. And that makes those funding available to all the different agencies and to those communities. The Georgia Sentinel Landscape is 6,387,436 acres in Georgia that's considered priority areas for conservation, restoration, the protection of working lands. So this includes acres of active base, but also many public and private landowners. So one of the functions that DoD can do is to actually reach out to private landowners and get them resources and encourage them to do things that will help to make not only their land more resilient to climate change, but also their communities more resilient to climate change. And they have been all in on that. And many of these nature-based solutions, while they affect climate change, they also increase water quality, which directly helps health, and they promote the safeguard of species and protect habitats and ecosystems. So the DoD and the program that I've been working with has really taken this on as a challenge to work with both other federal agencies, local communities, and state agencies to really turn things around on climate change. So I've got kind of a little bit of a good news story after Michelle's a little bit scary news story.
Good
Councilman
evening.
Dozier, go ahead.
Thanks, sorry. Good evening, y'all. I'm Councilmember Jason Dozier. I serve on the Atlanta City Council. I'm a little bit of the odd person out on this panel because I think we have a lot of professors. We have folks who have doctorates and been working in the trenches on this issue at a national level, on the policy level, and I represent about 45,000 people on the Atlanta City Council. And so why am I here? No, I'm in this, been involved in this work largely through a lens of community involvement, community advocacy, and community engagement. My district, I describe it for folks as Central Southwest Atlanta, everything from 5 Points to Fort McPherson. So if you've been to the Georgia Aquarium, you've been in my district. If you've been to 5 Points MARTA Station, you're in my district. If you've been to the Atlanta University Center, Morehouse College, Spelman College, Clark Atlanta University, you've been in my district. The West End community, if you've watched any of the Medea movies, the Medea House is in my district. And but what you can imagine is a district that goes from a large amount of density, a large density of transit, to parts of our city that are very suburban in terms of how it's been designed, how it's been developed, and you have communities that don't have sidewalks, don't have crosswalks, and a lot of that disparity is something that is why I do the work I do every day from a policy standpoint at Atlanta City Hall. Before I got elected to the Atlanta City Council, I did a lot of work in my home community of Mechanicsville. If you know where the Atlanta Braves used to play at Turner Field, or what's it called now, Georgia State Stadium or Park. The names changed a lot in the last couple of years. Mechanicsville is the community on the other side of the downtown connector. And when you think about neighborhoods like Mechanicsville, like Summerhill, like Peoplestown, and the amount of disinvestment that happened in communities like that over generations, that is honestly what got me into the work of community engagement, community advocacy. Moved into the neighborhood in 2015, and as a newer resident, wanted to get involved and wanted to learn more about my neighbors, especially since they were so welcoming of me and my family when we moved into the community. And one of the things I learned very quickly, this is around the time the Braves decided to leave for Cobb County, was that we have made as a city, as a community, as a state, disproportionately impacted neighborhoods like Mechanicsville. Mechanicsville, Summerhill, and Peoplestown collectively had about 30,000 residents, and we look at the 1950, 1960 census. Today, those communities only have about 7,000 or 8,000 people, and a big part of that was that we bulldozed a lot of those neighborhoods to build highways, to build sports arenas, to build seas of parking that unfortunately today contribute to issues like flooding, contribute to the heat island effect, contribute to the health disparities that we're trying to reverse through our policymaking at the city level, at the county level, at the state level. A lot of work that we've been doing in partnership with Emory to try to reverse that. And that led me to do work with an organization called the Turnerfield Community Benefits Coalition, which stood up in response to the Braves' departure from Turnerfield and saying, hey, we're tired of all these disparities. We're tired of all these negative externalities that have disproportionately impacted our community. We want a community benefits agreement. We want to be in partnership with the city and with the future developer, which we learned later was Georgia State University and a company called Carter, to ensure that we have a seat at the table so we can address the flooding, address the heat island effect and things like that. Unfortunately, we weren't successful in the fight to get a community benefits agreement, but that work then led to me being involved with an organization called Eco Action, which had been doing grassroots level community engagement work across the city, with a lot of work done actually in the Proctor Creek community over in Vine City, English Avenue. And we developed something called the Atlanta Watershed Learning Network, which was a peer-based group to really try to get community leaders or future leaders, people who don't even realize they're leaders, to really stand up for the community and learn about what green infrastructure is, to learn about how to do water monitoring, air quality monitoring, and all these sorts of things, to arm them with the equipment and the tools so that they can speak truth to power to City Hall, to their state legislators, to advocate and demand better for their communities. That work led to the creation of an organization called the Entrenchment Creek Community Stewardship Council. The Mechanicsville neighborhood and just south of downtown is actually the headwaters of the Entrenchment Creek watershed. The Georgia State, I tell people the Georgia State Capitol is right above where, if you look at those old maps, like the bird's eye view maps from the 1800s, Georgia State Capitol sits at that spot where the Entrenchment Creek watershed flows southeast towards the South River and through various tributaries eventually makes it to the Atlantic Ocean. But then when you think about what is in between, you have Turner Field, you have the parking lots, you have I-20, I-75, 85. It's a lot of great infrastructure that impedes that water flow. And so neighborhoods like Peoplestown and others downriver historically have been flooded whenever there's a big rainfall event. That community has what's called a combined sewer overflow system, and sewage and stormwater share the same pipes. And when in a big flooding event, which happens a lot more frequently because of climate change, you can imagine what happens to people's homes and the backage that goes into people's homes and the health issues that happen from that. And I share all this in this way because I am not environmental. I didn't major in environmental studies. I was a humanities major, y'all. I was a history major. And the fact that I've been able to learn and to be able to get into the weeds and to these issues is due to the work that I was able to do with the Entrenchment Creek Stewardship Council, with Eco Action and others, empowering communities in this work. That all led me to run for city council. And even though my community has a lot of great things happening. Downtown is coming back in a big way. It's great to represent historic communities. Also have a disproportionate amount of vulnerable residents in the city of Atlanta when it comes to displacement, when it comes to gentrification and all these other things that we're trying to address at the city level. The backdrop to a lot of that is despite my community advocacy work, I also didn't have a car in this city. I rode my bike. I took transit. The organization I was working at before I joined the city council is based in Alpharetta, and I was commuting, biking to the MARTA station, taking the train to North Springs, catching the bus to literally the northernmost bus stop in the MARTA system, and then biking another mile to the office and back, and doing that 4 days a week for 5 years. And that experience is a very radicalizing experience when you realize the disproportionality of how we invest in infrastructure and how we invest in communities across the city. And those are the sorts of things that lead to the policies that I advocate for today, led an effort to reduce the amount of parking that we have in our downtown part of our city. We have too much, Atlanta's an automobile-centric city, but a big part of that is because of the policies that we've been putting in place for decades. Those communities that we bulldozed in the 60s, we built parking lots, and people drive everywhere because we didn't invest in the right way. And so those are the sorts of things that I've been advocating for, in addition to working with our amazing Department of Watershed Management, trying to look at doing a stormwater utility, look at making sure developers are doing more to address stormwater runoff, because we know that climate change has drastically changed our models in terms of how frequent we'll experience a 100-year stormwater event. And so that's me in a nutshell. I'm glad to be part of this panel with all these amazing professors. But that's the reason why I've been driven to do this work, not only just because of my community engagement and community advocacy work, but part of my lived experience has seen what happens to cities when we don't plan for these sorts of things in the intentional ways that we need to. Yeah.
And speaking of professors, our last one.
It's hard to follow Councilman Dozier. It's challenging. So I'll just be quick here. As a law professor, I think of this challenge of climate resilience nexus and human impacts of disaster through sort of three lenses. And maybe I'll be sort of the Goldilocks sort of panelists, Matthew, if that's okay, between Dr. Covey and Dr. Ritchie here. Because I think there's a good news and a bad news story in each one. The first lens I think about is adaptation, right? How do we design a built environment that seeks to mitigate some of these climate harms? There's different ways to adapt. Dr. Ritchie and Dr. Covey talked about many of those, building seawalls to resist. We could adjust your standards, such as what Councilman Dozier's dealing with, construction standards and zoning standards through accommodation. Or you could retreat. Councilman Dozier's in the Army, I was in the Navy. We don't like saying retreat. We say we're just advancing in a different direction, right?
Reposition.
Repositioning, exactly. So that has but how we talk about this actually really matters, right? If you talk about retreat, people associate that with loss and moving away and displacement. And we have a very, very tragic history in this country about forced retreat, forced displacement. So I do think we need to make sound adaptation decisions even before disaster strikes. It's pathway dependent. If adaptation decisions are smart, then the impacts following disaster will be not as bad, ameliorated. And the good news is that we know that good adaptation measures is a good return on investment. And Councilman Dozier has been very humble here, but he's really taken the lead, I think, nationally on what he's doing for Beltline and parking minimums, and looking at Atlanta's zoning to make it more people-centric, more resilient, more transportation-focused, getting people out of the cars. I'm relatively new to Atlanta, and people say Atlanta influences everything, and I think Councilman Dozier, honestly, is influencing a lot of things with his important work here on the City Council. But of course, there's a bad news story, all right? And the bad news is that a lot of these legal issues we want to talk about or adaptation that we want to do runs into legal challenges. And I'm happy to talk about that during Q&A. We are a very strong private property rights country, right? If you were to build a seawall, if you were to do some kind of construction standard, you will face litigation. And I love lawyers. I train lawyers on a daily basis, but we're a very litigious country, and we're a very pro-private property rights country. That's just the reality of the United States since the Fifth Amendment came about in 1789. And we also know that adaptation exacerbates inequalities. Like Councilman Dozier's neighborhood in Mechanicsville is going to look different from Buckhead. It's going to look different from others. So if you have the resources to adapt, the wealthier neighborhoods are going to have those resources. Okay. So the sort of second lens is sort of the federal disaster law and policies. And again, there's a good news and bad news story here as well. We have a pretty robust legislative framework for disaster response, really embodied by what's called the Stafford Act, which is triggered whenever a governor requests a major disaster. And federal funds flow. In fact, federal funds often flow too easily following a natural disaster. We know that every 3 weeks or so, there's $1 billion with a B natural disaster in this country, and that's increasing in frequency, intensity, and strength. And so we have some good news from the federal government with the bipartisan infrastructure law. We have now a climate resilience framework, and all this money is slowly trickling down. Probably not as fast as we want to, Councilman Dozier, right? But it's coming. It's coming, and that's historic investments in how we prepare for disaster that is coming for us. And of course, the bad news is that we have what I call the YOLO climate problem. You only live once, where people are actually changing or making a decision to move to places like Florida on the coastline and places like Texas that are have lower taxes and sunshine, but are more exposed to climate risk. So we have a demographic problem that is not adequately taking into account climate risk. And oh, by the way, the National Flood Insurance Program subsidizes building in the coastal zone as well, subsidizes what I call sandcastles. Okay, so local in Georgia, and what are we doing here in Georgia and local is just sort of the third lens. And I'll just highlight that Atlanta does have a climate action plan. That's good. We're developing a new one. I like to see that, and we're working that and come out that soon. The bad news is that Georgia, we don't have a lot of the mandatory disclosure laws for flood and things along those lines. So in this state, you often have less information when you buy a new home than if you were to buy a used car, right? And some of those important decisions of your life, think about a first-time home buyer, they might not fully know that they're buying in a climate risk zone, a flood risk zone. So some states are ahead of us in Georgia on this, but we're kind of a laggard on that. So that's how I think about this framework of this panel discussion today. Adaptation, look at federal law, and then look at Georgia and what Atlanta's doing. And that's how I think about it.
Lots to unpack. I mean, I think we can all tell this is a big and complicated subject. And one of the things that comes to mind for me based on some of our previous conversations and based on one of the exhibits here at the Science Gallery, and this question is for you, Councilman Dozier, I think. If we are considering the way the future is going, and we know that there are going to be more climate refugees moving into the city of Atlanta, we talk about things like zoning, we talk about green infrastructure. How do we help Atlanta prepare for this influx of essentially climate refugees while making sure that the increasing number of people in the city doesn't additionally contribute to the problem of climate change?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. It's something that I think about a lot, and thank you for saying that, because I meant to bring that up during my introduction as well. But one of the things that keeps me up at night is that we know, just through all of our different models, through the analysis that we've done through our regional studies and things like that, Atlanta will be a destination for climate refugees, because we already have been. When you think about what happened after Hurricane Katrina in 2005, a lot of New Orleans and Louisianans, residents and Louisianans ended up in Atlanta and in the Atlanta area. And when we see what's happening with insurance rates in Florida, when you see what's happening in the Gulf Coast, when you see what's happening even on Georgia's coast with the rising sea walls and things like that, we know that people are going to come to Atlanta. Atlanta's a relatively insulated city from natural disasters. When you think about hurricanes, when you think about earthquakes and things like that, it's a destination for a lot of those reasons. And so we have to be prepared by making sure we're building housing so that folks have a place to live, so that folks aren't going to be, challenged when they come here. Atlanta's housing is increasing at rates that we see across the country. In response to that, our mayor has been pushing to build 20,000 new affordable housing units by the end of his second term. However, I counted that is not enough considering the rates of in growth that we're experiencing as a city. The other challenge that's a part of that as well is that these issues aren't exclusive to the city of Atlanta. The city of Atlanta is only 500,000 people, which folks don't realize. Our metro area is about 6 million people. the city of Atlanta is only 500,000 people, and the same sort of market pressures that we're experiencing as a city are also being experienced in Sandy Springs and Johns Creek and Roswell and in South DeKalb. And we see a lot of communities really trying to struggle and deal with access to housing. The other piece that we have to be able to address is and support is this idea that we have to build density and build for density, because transit, the thing that's going to get people out of their cars and reduce the challenges to our air quality and really get us to the promised land of sustainability and resilience, requires density to be successful. And as a city, historically, we've been allergic to density. I know we've had active conversations just in the last couple of months about should we be building 800 new units right next to the Beltline, this huge, beautiful transit corridor that we were investing in. Should we be bringing people into communities? Just as an example, and I'll close, West End, my community West End in the 1970 census had 17,000 residents, and today it's about 5,000 residents. And a lot of people in our communities don't realize that our communities are much more supportive of density, because we have done that in the past, but we just, for whatever reason, decided that we want to build single-family homes everywhere. We want to get in our cars and drive everywhere. And my goal as a policymaker is to get us in a direction that gets more density, that reduces the carbon per capita carbon footprint by getting more people in our neighborhoods, and makes transit more not just sustainable, but also financially sustainable, fiscally sustainable, because we have more people, more riders, more users. But that's the challenge, is we know more people are coming. We have to be able to respond to that, but that means building in a way that's intentional, that's thoughtful, and that's centered around density, so that more people can share the amenities that we have.
So that comes down to preparedness, right? We know this is coming. We've got to be prepared for it. We have to do the building. We have to do the infrastructure. I'm sure there's legal challenges that are involved with that. If I want to build a train system somewhere and somebody's house is in the way, you've got a problem. But on the topic of preparedness, and Dr. Ritchie, this is probably appropriate for you, when we're thinking about public health and preparing for climate change, we've seen the results of unpreparedness in the last pandemic that we had, even though we knew for 100 years something like that would probably hit us again. Do you think there's similar challenges that we face in terms of making sure that we're prepared for climate? I mean, we know it's coming, so is there pushback? Are there walls that we're running up against? Do we not have enough seawalls?
Yeah, nice easy question. Thank you for that. So I guess looking at preparedness, especially in disaster management, if it's in disaster management, we typically talk about mitigation, preparedness, response, and recovery. And I'm pretty squarely within the preparedness mitigation side. So I do a lot of like hazard mitigation plans, or talk about the Stafford Act. If you have one of those in place, you can get some of those funds, for example. So one thing that helps with preparedness is having plans in place. Disaster management as a field historically has been very response-based. And so we typically wait for a disaster to happen, and then we come up with rules after and lessons learned. And that's kind of problematic for all the reasons you think of, but also because every disaster is unique. And so it's nice if you have a playbook on the shelf, nice plan, but the key comes in with the preparedness, getting the muscle memory of actually doing trainings with communities, getting out and talking to folks, Really, that communication piece is critical. So if you don't have a plan in place, if you haven't practiced that plan, if you haven't updated that plan, you're kind of setting yourself up for failure. So the number one things that come to mind for me would be making sure you have a plan and that you've practiced that plan, and that folks are involved at the plan from its inception to its update, to just understanding where it is, how to access it. Having that information be a little more publicly available can make things seem a little less scary, right? Knowing we have a plan in place. I do this with my students. We look through the University of Georgia's hazard mitigation plan, and it kind of debunks some of those myths. We're able to go out and actually propose new solutions based on that. So,
well, on those risks, I mean, if we're looking at preparedness, and let's look at human willingness to carry out that preparedness. I mean, if we're talking about whether that's public health risk and people refusing to wear masks, or maybe that means people refusing to implement the changes that are necessary to prepare for climate, whether that means help building infrastructure or reducing the use of vehicles. I mean, how much is human stubbornness a part of this problem?
Well, I think that fundamentally it's understandable. People have a very strong attachment to place. It's where their churches, where they go grocery shopping, their friends, their support network is. That's completely understandable. I think how that translates is that people historically have really underestimated the risk, right, wherever you may be. So I've always said, fundamentally, we need to really democratize this information, right? We need to be speaking to people in a way that they can understand and access the information. Frankly, having less professors telling people how to live their life or how to plan for climate change, and more listening to what do people need. A lot of what concerns me right now is that a lot of our risk information is actually behind paywalls, or it's proprietary, and the people who have access to wealth can actually access information. The people who are just trying to live their day-to-day lives, they may not understand fully the risks that are in place. So I think fundamentally you have to really kind of level set the field and democratize risk information.
And I guess what I would add is when you're actually trying to prepare a community for climate change, it goes a little bit beyond sort of just sort of even multitasking. It has to be really forward looking. And where I have seen this been done most successfully is when you can break down the silos between the different departments. When I lived in Virginia Beach, they did this really, really well as they were preparing for their first climate study. And I'll note that one of the reasons that really got a very conservative community to start to move towards doing climate change was they got a report from Moody that said this is going to threaten your credit ratings if you're not planning for climate change. And so, believe me, the council people looked at that as a very serious issue now. We need to come up with something. And they actually broke down the silos. The engineers were talking to the planners, we're talking to the folks in recreation, we're talking to the educators at the aquarium. All the different departments across the city were talking to each other about this, and this is going to and really moving together as a whole unit. And that's what I see as needed in climate. We can't just depend on one department. It's not an emergency management problem. It's not just a planning problem. It's a everyone on board type of problem.
But clearly at the same time, everybody's not on board. I mean, and we're running up against all sorts of pushback. And, we can see even in the DOD's own directives, coming from the executive branch about climate change, they've sometimes been told, take all this language out. You're not allowed to talk about it. And in the meantime, they know there's still a problem. They have to deal with rising sea levels. They have to deal with troops who are operating with not enough water. They have to deal with aircraft tires and temperatures of the runways that they're landing on. So if they're not allowed to talk about climate change, how do we get around that to make sure that we're still being prepared, whether that's legally or functionally, or even at the city level?
I'll say just at the city level, I mean, we do a lot of aspirational things. We pass resolutions saying, hey, we want to hit a 100% renewable energy goal by 2035. We want to expand our tree canopies, currently 45%. We want to get to 50% by the end of the year. And those aspirational things are great, and it gets people excited and gets us kind of as a city aligning our internal city policies toward those things. But we have a very strong development community. We have a very vocal residential community that may not necessarily see eye to eye with the policies that we're trying to achieve as a city. And one of the things that I found helpful in terms of getting us to that goal of resilience and sustainability as a city is leveraging some of our zoning codes to really put a pause on the type of development that we know are exacerbating these negative issues that create problems for our communities when it comes to climate change. I know Mark in his introduction talked about some of the things that we've introduced as a city around the Atlanta Beltline. I presume everyone here is from the Atlanta area. I know sometimes when we do these panels, you got folks from different parts of the country, so I'm not going to explain what the Beltline is, but we last year removed parking minimums in Atlanta Beltline, allowing developers to have a more market oriented way in terms of, hey, maybe I don't need any parking. Maybe I don't need to. Maybe I could take some economic risk. But we also straight up banned new drive-through restaurants, and we banned new gas stations within the Beltline overlay, because that automobile-centric use is something that creates physical challenges for pedestrians and cyclists that are trying to navigate our city. We also lowered the parking maximums in downtown and midtown, our two densest parts of our city. We said that, hey, there's already an abundance of parking. We've already torn down all of our historic buildings to build parking lots and parking decks. We don't need any more of that. We're going to lower the cap that currently exists. And then just a couple of weeks ago, the city of Atlanta passed a ban on data centers within our urban core, near transit as well as near the Beltline. And as we were working on the legislation, we talked about it from the standpoint of the, data centers present, land use in the city is kind of a zero-sum situation. Every data center that you build is a apartment building that you're not building, is an office building that you're not building. All these things that have active uses. Data centers have 5 to 10 employees for a 100,000 square foot facility. We don't want that. But at the same time, data centers are a huge environmental challenge for communities across America, and it's something that every community in every state is starting to reckon with. The amount of water that they use to keep those servers cooled is something that cities are having to deal with. The amount of power draw that they have, thankfully, and I apologize if any Bitcoin folks are in the room, thankfully the crypto market has kind of, subsided, but the demand for data and the use of AI has especially driven up the use of power across the country. And when you think about the fact that as a ratepayer, as someone who has a regular power bill that's going up tremendously this year because of the change that Georgia Power has made. Now I have a data center in my backyard that is also increasing that demand. It's also going to hit my pocketbook directly as well. It's something that we're continuing with across the country. So what I learned in the data center fight is that Atlanta is actually one of the leaders in the country in terms of fighting back against data centers at the municipal level. We've seen a lot of large conversation around tax incentives and things like that other communities are dealing with, but a lot of these national data center companies are looking at Atlanta and saying, okay, did Atlanta's leading, our other cities are going to start doing this, because then it's a threat to the industry. So that's been a really interesting conversation, but it's something that municipalities across America need to really get their control the reins on, because that's a huge risk for our ability to meet our sustainability and resiliency goals.
And if I could just back to this idea of stubbornness, I do also see in my research the concept of place identity being really strong. And so in some cases, it's less opposition to things that are coming in to save whoever, we're putting in these adaptation strategies, and more a fear of losing the identity of the current place as it stands. And so in my research, I found that if you can somehow integrate those, that it helps. But also, I think some of the stubbornness does come from just the word climate change. I was hired under the changing climate cluster hire. So even the University of Georgia itself, who hired me to teach climate change, did not use the words climate change. So in some of in my classes, I talk about climate change, was just talking about the impacts today, and I know there are climate deniers in the class, and this may be divisive, but I honestly don't care if they believe in climate change or not, because it makes no difference. Everybody that I've been able to talk to, whether they're here in Georgia or they're up in Alaska in the middle of nowhere, or they're somewhere in Norway, 99% of people don't want to hurt other people. They don't want to see the environment degraded, and they feel some sort of guilt. And there's just more of an obstacle of what do we do now? And so using more terms of environmental hazards, sometimes I get around it that way. But I think a lot of the stubbornness is coming from less of a fear of the new and a fear of the losing the old.
And let's talk about that for a minute. And Professor Nevitt, I think we're going to get right into what I know you want to talk about, and that's that's about things that are appearing in our backyards, like the ocean, that are finally knocking down the homes that we've built in these vulnerable areas. And you've written a piece, fairly recently, exploring this idea of whether or not we should rebuild when things get destroyed. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, happy to address that, but just real quick on what I agree with Dr. Ritchie you just said, and you may not know this, but Dr. Covey and I, we met about 10 years ago when I was wearing a uniform in the Navy, working in Norfolk, Virginia, and we worked on a whole of government pilot project, and I wanted to call it the whole of government climate change project for Hampton Roads, Norfolk, Virginia area, and we were told no. Talk about recurrent flooding, talk about extreme weather, talk about the impacts, don't talk about climate change, because politically you get more buy-in. I think we're slowly moving the dial, right? The dial, I think, is being moved positively. I think that if we were to do that again in Norfolk, Dr. Covey, I think we would have more success. But on my central argument on a lot of my research is that we have sort of laws and policies designed for Earth 1.0, right? We're entering Earth 2.0. We need to have forward visionary thinkers like Councilman Wallin, Councilman Dozier, who are thinking about what is the world going to look like in 10, 20, 30 years, because what we're doing right now is just insufficient. Right? We have a bunch of policies where we essentially subsidize risk, and then when disaster strikes, there's a very strong political and understandable desire to help the people that were affected. But oftentimes that money flows, and we don't make smart land use decisions in the aftermath. I'll give you one example, there are many. Severe repetitive loss properties. After the event, go Google that. It's very sobering. I think this is an opportunity for bipartisanship, because this is taxpayer money that is spent to rebuild homes over and over and over again after disaster strikes. In my article, I talk about one home in Mississippi rebuilt 35 times, and it's worth about $60,000, and the cost was close to $1 million. I mean, this is just insane. Right? This is federal taxpayer dollars that have done this over and over and over again. So we need to fundamentally actually rethink our disaster laws, our policies. What we do at adaptation has to be in conversation with disaster. I think we need to start thinking about sunsetting some of these subsidies, like the National Flood Insurance Program. What's interesting to me, and I'll pick on Florida here, because I'm in Georgia, but the insurance market in Florida is in upheaval right now. What has happened? That happened is that state insurance is sort of filling the void to do a lot of the rebuilding in place via the Citizens Insurance Program. Something similar has happened in Louisiana as well, but I think it's more marked in Florida. So, but fundamentally, Matthew, we need to start thinking about reshaping our laws and policies. That's why, Councilman Dozier, I'm always going to vote for you. I may all move to McCannassville and start casting my ballot.
So I want to use that to ask one final question to Dr. Covey before we turn it over to the audience for some Q&A. And that is the idea of, should we retreat? And when we're looking at our military bases, some of which are incredibly strategic, that have major roles in supporting our Navy or in supporting the nuclear triad, or in some cases, some of our advanced stealth fighters, and we see these bases get completely wiped out by extreme weather, things that the Chinese essentially wish that they could do in their wildest dreams. What is the military doing? I mean, you're talking about these natural barriers. What can the military do to better defend these, or should they consider packing up and moving?
Well, unfortunately, there are real reasons that the military cannot retreat from a lot of these areas. I mean, for one thing, for a lot of the Navy functions, you do actually have to be on the water because there are, ships which are connected.
Unless you're an aviator.
Right, and there are plenty of Navy facilities that aren't on the water if you're learning how to fly planes and land them and things like that. So those kinds of functions and training can be done other places. But there are Tyndall Air Force Base was basically completely destroyed by Hurricane Michael, and the Air Force had to think really hard about what they were going to do with that particular location. And my understanding was, they have this training area that's over the eastern part of the Gulf of Mexico. That's all airspace that's owned by the DoD that cannot be replicated anywhere else. You cannot get that kind of airspace for training and testing and those purposes. And they said, we just can't do it. We've got to rebuild. And what they decided to do was build an installation of the future and really look at those future circumstances. On the coastal resilience side, they're actually trying some new things, doing some innovations to see what they can do to protect the installation from further out in the water. But on the installation side, they're saying, we had a big lawn here that we used to mow. We're not going to do that anymore. We're going to do green infrastructure. We're going to have trees. We're going to absorb water. They're kind of designing it in a totally different way. So There are some cases where probably retreat is not going to be the solution. I also think there are particular populations of folks, and I can think about the Gullah Geechee people in St. Helena, in South Carolina, or on Sapelo Island that have been living there as a part of their lives. You know, they have a relationship with the land that is unique, and we should be supporting what we can do to allow them to keep their way of life for as long as possible. So I think there are some exceptions to that, although I generally agree with new development on the coast. We're very lucky in Georgia because of the Marshland Protection Act. I mean, that was something in the 1970s that was put into place, and the story that I've heard from some of my colleagues is that the individual that really put that act in place basically sacrificed his political career to save the marshes in Georgia. And so we're very lucky because we have probably the most natural shoreline for an entire state of any state, particularly on the East Coast. So there are some we tend to be lucky, but there are some places where we should actually support the people that have been there.
Your comment on the green lawns makes me kind of laugh, because being a Californian, occasionally passing by Pepperdine University has the largest lawn I've ever seen in my life in water-starved California. But the last time fires came through Malibu, all of that clear space and very, very saturated lawn actually saved the university. So sometimes it works not quite the way you intended, but it works well. So with that, I want to turn it over to the audience to make sure anybody who's got some questions we can get to. I think there's a mic that's passed around, so let's play this classroom style. Raise your hand. I see a woman right over here in the right shirt. Go ahead, and then we'll pass it to you next. Oh, okay.
Hello, my name is Maya Rivera from the City of Atlanta. As the education team director, part of the American I have a question. I recognize that the city sees that there are heat and flood vulnerability challenges, there's housing challenges, there's density challenge. I stood up dry. It's been 5 months. So I'm holding on as long as I can. The question I have for each one of you is what do you think is missing right now to actually operationalize these challenges on the ground? Whether it's Mechanicsville, Ellenwood Park, what is needed to operationalize these challenges? Whether it's the jobs that are needed, communication, what is the gap that we can fill right now to be able to help push a lot of these challenges forward?
I can go. For me, I think the biggest issue is I don't think that we get the support from the state that we need to really address these challenges in the meaningful way that we know we can. We've done a lot of studies, a lot of research at the city level. I don't think the city of Atlanta is starved for knowing what we need to do. We just completed a heat vulnerability assessment just last year in partnership with Georgia Tech to figure out where we should really invest the dollars that we need to invest to address the heat island effect challenge that I mentioned before, and at the granular neighborhood level that we didn't have the data before to support that. We are about to introduce legislation to redo our tree protection ordinance so that we can get to that 50% goal that we talked about before. But a lot of these things, a lot of these initiatives require it's late. Require investment, particularly from the state. The state of Georgia doesn't fund transit in the way they do in Virginia and New York and California. The state of Georgia doesn't support housing in the way they do in other parts of the country. And so getting our state leaders, particularly the governor, but especially our state legislators, aligned in the work that we're doing as a city. We are the capital of the state, but we're also the lead economic generator of the state as well. And so getting them to recognize that and support these issues in that way, I think is the thing that's been missing the most. Like the feds can be aligned, the city can be aligned, but having a state aligned, I think will get us to where we need to go.
Yeah, I know you're working on part of the Atlanta climate plan. Georgia needs a climate plan as well. We need to be working in synchrony. Atlanta metropolitan area, 6.5 million people. We need to talk about climate refugees. The very first question, it's just not going to be Atlanta. It's going to be a bit broader than that. Resources is harder because it's financially, but I think zoning, or what Atlanta is doing with zoning, is really important. It doesn't necessarily cost money, allowing the private sector to basically make smart investment decisions around the Beltline, transit-oriented development, and communication as well, better education, better access. The resources is not as resource strained as well. So those are a few ideas I have for you, but I think that I would love it the day that Atlanta announces this new climate action plan. The state of Georgia has a climate plan as well. And I think 40 states or so have a climate plan. Georgia is a laggard in that right now.
Go ahead.
Hi, my name is Laura Martin. I am a disaster response professional. For 17 years, I've been working at the intersection of international humanitarian response, disaster response in the U.S., climate change, and helped a group of folks establish the Center for Humanitarian Emergencies at Emory University's Wallin School of Public Health. I work for myself at this moment in time. I also am a disaster survivor. So I'm actually going to start with a comment, because in the HIV world, we have a phrase that says, not about us, without us. And I would really love to see a conversation around disaster with communities that we serve. For over 30 years, communities have been leading in the research around environment, the impact of climate change on public health, the realities of the impact of disasters. They've been collecting the data and providing it to researchers like you, like me, and they should be not just the topic of conversation, but part of this conversation. Putting that aside and hoping that you still like me, I am working on a project right now. I'm a part of the Just Energy Academy with the Partnership for Southern Equity. I also happen to be from Central Florida, living in Georgia. It's complex. But I've just reviewed Georgia's new emergency preparedness response and recovery plan, which, putting it very kindly and trying to be diplomatic, appears to be maybe a graduate research project. And there's no community involved in that. There are lists of organizations, there's Georgia Power, there's other types of entities, but I don't see community organizations in those lists or engaged in that. And I think that also reflects what y'all were just talking about around state leadership. Not only without a climate action plan, but in these types of plans and the lacks of investment and resources available, what would be some solutions? I have a segue, I promise. What would be some solutions, realistic, honestly, that you could propose, not only around communities being part of this work, but also the state leadership adequately resourcing it?
Well, I'll just say for research, myself and my Sea Grant colleagues put co-production right in the center of work. So we've got 34 programs in coastal states around the U.S. and we require, and that's the idea of extension, is we require any research, and we don't have big research dollars, but for our small research dollars, we require any research that we do involves an extension person, and our extension people are embedded with the community. So they know the communities really well, and they work with those communities very, very closely to make sure that they are represented in the research. And we are heartened, it's not there yet, but we are heartened that the dollars are starting to show up. It is something being recognized by many of the grantors. They're like, hey, where's your authentic engagement in your research? I know certainly this is true with NOAA. I think it's coming online with National Science Foundation and some of these other funders. They're saying, hey, where's your authentic engagement? Where is your community-based organization you're working with? That said, those community-based organizations are also getting taxed out. Like, how much time do they have to contribute? How can we authentically get them compensated for their time and energy? And so we're starting to see some of that flow so that You're starting to see some positions at these community-based organizations that are resilience, climate resilience positions, but it's just at the very beginning. So you are absolutely right, and some people are hearing this and trying to respond, but it's not easy, especially at universities.
Yes, go ahead.
Hi, I'm Mandy Mahoney. What role do you see the Atlanta Regional Commission playing in this?
I'll take an initial stab at that and say that I love that question because I don't know if when the last time this has happened, but the chair of the Atlanta Regional Commission is Mayor Andre Dickens of the city of Atlanta. So there's a strong opportunity to lean on ARC for support in alignment across the region for the things that the city has been pushing for some time. I think one of the challenges that ARC has is that there's a lot of cats to herd, and not every community is in agreement with some of the things, some of the studies, some of the research that ARC is leading on. And I think that that's where the city of Atlanta has a unique role to play to show that, hey, this has been successful here. What can we bring, what best practices can we bring to your community? Doing that in partnership, not just with ARC, but also with the Georgia Municipal Association, also in partnership with, there's a number of different organizations that aren't just City of Atlanta focused that are spreading the gospel and doing that good work. But I do think, to your point, is a unique opportunity because of the alignment that exists currently within the city of Atlanta as well as with ARC because of that shared leadership. But where do we go from here? Versus, I know World Cup is important. Everything's planned around World Cup, but there's some longer timelines, sort of bigger picture things that we ought to be planning for as a region to be able to support the good work that City of Atlanta has already been doing.
Gentlemen.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate all the comments. My name is Adetunji Anthony Adeleke. I'm glad to be part of this. I actually came from Indianapolis for this event. I've lived here in Atlanta before. So as an immigrant, I came to Atlanta first. And I see the nexus of how we talk about impact. But in reality, some of what we do is opposite and in conflict to what we purpose to do. The COVID-19 situation taught us a lot, the interdependencies for us in the world and how we shouldn't just think about ourselves, but think in the wider frame. Even when we act locally, we should have concerns for others because one day it could be you or it could be me. So how are we measuring those impacts, and how are we using those measurements to recalibrate back to what goes around comes around in terms of our, just like it's been said, we're talking of the city. I see Atlanta could be a major showcase for people to see as examples if done right. But because I believe the US, Georgia and Atlanta have a lot of resources to back this up. A lot of this is something that it's difficult to implement because some of those that are affected do not have the resources to handle the situation, especially in other countries or in other parts of the country, even like in Louisiana when things happen. So how are we measuring those impacts, and how could we use some of those to shape our national and foreign policies so that the impact can be multiplied rather than trying to do it alone? Thank you.
Takers? I'll comment a little bit. I'm sure there are people who are looking at this a little bit. I don't have any data on that to begin with. For me, I study a lot of public diplomacy. That's how the United States is perceived by foreign countries, how we build relationships. And I think part of this is about a cultural philosophy, is do we care about our neighbors? Do we care about supporting our communities? And I'd say there's a lot of that in the United States. Americans are a very generous people. Our government might not give a lot of aid overseas compared to other countries, but when you look at private giving, it's significant. If we can translate into that resilience, building, making sure that we are protecting our neighbors and preparing them for disasters. There are specific communities in the United States that have that as their ethos. So I think tapping into that and working to expand it could be key. Is there data on it? I'm not sure. I think we've got time for one.
If I could just, I'm sorry, just add to that just quickly as a friendly amendment is, what we haven't talked about is also who responds to the disasters, right? Quickly, the emergency first responders are quickly overwhelmed, and the data is out there that's pretty clear that the emergency first responders are stressed. We have wildfires happening in California right now, and just a couple years ago, 6 wildfire fighters lost their lives, right? So part of the discussion, it's like climate impacts not just impacts the people who are living in certain areas, and of course we need to be resilient, we need to be adaptation, but you know, the emergency first responders are a stressed force. You mentioned COVID-19. That was the largest military deployment since the Second World War domestically was COVID-19. You had the National Guard basically driving buses, doing medical supplies, things along those lines. That's the force we have right now that's going to respond if it is a natural disaster. Internationally, I would just say when I was in the Navy, the Secretary of the Navy used to always say that the request for humanitarian assistance, disaster response upon the Department of Defense, these are nations that are just overwhelmed internationally, he would get a request once every 2 weeks from nations seeking assistance from the U.S. Navy, come help us. Essentially, the U.S. military is the world's de facto 911 force when there's something bad happens internationally. So this is not just, this is a broader conversation. Hopefully I'm whetting your appetite a little bit for maybe the conversation and for over drinks, but it's a bigger conversation.
One final question before I offer drinks.
Hello.
Yes, ma'am.
I will keep it short so we can have our drinks. But I wanted to know all of your opinions. We have all seen all of the pushback on DEI and just any type of inclusivity within all sectors, but especially in environmental sciences and environmental response, there is a significant lack of diversity, and I think that also impacts our response and how people listen to us when we try, especially in disasters, try to get people to leave their homes in order for safety. If you don't look like me, why should I listen to you, essentially? And I am an epidemiologist. I also heard this during COVID, trying to get people to not get sick. But just wanted to know, what are your thoughts on how we can get more people of color, more diverse voices into the environmental health fields during all of this political pushback?
I'll say just once again, as a non-practitioner in this space, but something that you shared earlier, I think is absolutely important. I think exposure to the field as early as possible to get communities that have been disinvested, that historically haven't had the pipeline to go to these elite universities to study these issues. That exposure, I think, is key. I think the work that Partnership for Southern Equity is doing, the work that EcoAction is doing, the work that a lot of community organizing, community focus groups are doing to get people who are negatively impacted by climate change and by the heat island effect and by flooding, to be able to articulate what's happening to them and then turn that into policy and then learn how to really to have the education behind them to really be a force of nature in that regard, I think is a way to do that, because a lot of communities just aren't connected to that work as intuitively as maybe, we have a lot of organizations doing like trades and things coming into high schools and coming to middle schools to teach people about what career opportunities are out there. I think the sciences needs to be a lot more aggressive in that to build the next generation and to get people exposed, because I wasn't exposed. Like I said, I was a history major for a reason, but I think that if I had the right sort of mentorship and connection early on, I would be a professor just like the folks on this panel as well.
Just a quick reaction to that as well is, we haven't talked about environmental justice, climate justice. We can maybe talk about that maybe during the reception. I'll just put a quick plug. Within law, it's particularly pronounced. There's very few environmental lawyers who come from communities of color, disadvantaged communities. I'll just put a plug in for Emory. Emory University does have a DEI program where we're trying to target and find the next generation of leaders with a DEI scholarship funding. So, but I think more programs like that is good.
Yeah, and my comment would be mentorship, and I think it puts a lot of pressure on you, because you're the person that's probably going to be the mentor. But we have seen that, particularly in marine sciences, we've had a number of successes with folks that have really been leaders. I have a colleague that I knew at Hampton University that was just phenomenal and had so many and brought in so many people to marine sciences. I think that we need to invest in HBCUs and encourage HBCUs to have these kinds of programs, whether they're disaster or science programs in general, or in my case marine sciences. So I think there are a lot of different ways, but I think that personal touch, that mentorship, it puts a lot of pressure on those first people coming through, but they make the way for everybody else. So I think that's really important.
And I'll just add also from the professors' perspectives and those who are hiring need to be so much more transparent about how they're going about picking their applicants. Who are we actually recruiting? Where is that messaging going? Is it going to those knowledge boards that stay insular within our communities, or are we actually taking an active role to try and hire folks? I had one female professor that I can credit with having shown me that it's possible. One, in all of my schooling, undergrad, grad school, master's, PhD. So yeah, from kind of calling us out as professors, like where are we putting those ads, right? How are we recruiting folks from different communities is really important.
And I'll comment based on my experience as somebody who does some hiring, is it from the data that I can go on based on the applicants that we receive, we don't receive a lot of people of color. And I don't know, like, this maybe my own fault or my own problem. I don't know how to find them. And I've done outreach. I've reached out to HBCUs, spent a lot of time doing it, and we still just get barely a few that might trickle in. So in some sense, we've got whoever applies. I will say that you're absolutely right. There's a problem, especially on the Hill, and I've spent plenty of time, rummaging through Congress and dealing with offices that push back really hard on the DEI concept. And you almost can't start a conversation there because they're unwilling to listen to it. So, and we face some of the same issues on climate change, which is why we talk about it as climate security as opposed to climate change, to try to find some receptiveness. I think that sometimes, rather than going in and bringing your insistence that this is a problem, because it is, if they're not willing to listen to it, try to get them to ask the right questions. Redirect what their angst is about. So it's not, why isn't this happening? It's, well, what's the information that you're actually trying to get to? And then feeding them the questions to ultimately solve the problem that you're trying to solve. And you might find that you need more people of color and able to get you the proper information about what's going on in these communities. And if you're ignoring them, you're not going to get that information. You're not going to be able to solve the problem. So it's about problem solving. And sometimes just knowing the audience that you're talking to and trying to speak in their language to get them to do what we know we need them to do. It's tough. But what's not so tough is drinking wine. So we've got plenty of it. I thank you all for coming. I appreciate the time and the traffic that you braved to get here. And thank, again, Emory University and the Science Gallery. And if you want to check out more about what ASP has written on climate security, it's americansecurityproject.org. Thank you all very much.